Hi, everyone. Welcome to the distribution team demo for February 23rd, 2023. I'm going to be talking a little bit about encrypted configuration today. And just on a programming note, I was talking to DJ a little bit before we started the recording. I have really limited outbound bandwidth, and this is my first attempt at doing a Zoom recording and doing a screen share, and I don't really know how well that's going to come across. If it doesn't, then I'll go back, watch the recording, and then do a re-recording of this demo. But so this is sort of a trial run for that if we need to do that. Um, I do have a set of notes in our distribution demo team notes with some URLs that will also help to browse as I'm going along. And I'm just going to load those URLs in a browser and use that to share the screen and kind of anchor our attention to that. So I will get going and let's see how well this works. Share. All right. So I should be sharing my browser window now, and we'll get started. I'm also very aware that there are two meetings at 11 a.m. Eastern time, or I guess that's 4 p.m. UTC. Both George's first CTO office hours and our enablement performance indicators. So I'm going to try my best to all for 11 a.m. Eastern time this morning, and just kind of go through this quickly. So I'm sharing the initial MR, and in the notes, just a little bit of background about this, what we're talking about this morning for encrypted secrets. In 13.7, DJ put together an MR that makes use of the added an encrypted configuration class to the Rails app that makes use of reading and writing to an encrypted file using the active support libraries that to do encryption that are built into also for Rails secrets. And that library ends up using a key generator function that just builds on top of OpenSSL. So the DJ's work added that to the core of, or at least our Rails application, made it available in the core settings class. I'm going to switch over to the tab where you can call it a settings.encrypted for a given path, a file name for a set of encrypted secrets or an empty file that it can create and write to. And we'll return that encrypted configuration. And that encrypted configuration class has some useful routines for writing, reading, returning the encrypted contents, the decrypted contents, and just pulling that information back out. And that same library was initially used for LDAP credentials for encrypting the LDAP credentials and leaving that out of the GitLab.rb in 13.7, and then really was used again for the SMTP credentials too. And I've got both of those, that the merge request for the encrypted SMTP credentials for the GitLab project, as well as the omnibus side MR for this, and 14.2. I've got those linked in the demo notes as well. And really so there's core support for reading and writing and encrypted file using the OpenSSL routines. And a set of rake tasks for editing the file, for showing the contents of the file, and for piping from a third party or an existing file or a set of parameters that you want to use, and piping that through a write action that would end up writing the encrypted file. And all of that really, and I'm going to So as I'm a little nervous for the first time here, that overarching epic is part of an epic created back in 2020 for doing a secure solution for managing omnibus configuration secrets. And the sub epic that's part of that is the actual passwords themselves, where we've identified the ones that we can and can't, or the ones that will make sense encrypting in the main Rails app, or just things that have to be managed outside that application itself. And so LDAP, SMTP, the incoming email and service desk email for Rails that's used by Mailroom, the DB password, the Redis password, and then there's an add-on here that I didn't get to the Microsoft Graph part as part of the incoming email password. So before I go into, I've talked a little fast, as I mentioned, but before I go into kind of where I began approaching this and began working on, are there any questions so far about DJ's work in 13.7, or what we did, extending that as you look at those MRs, how we extended that at first to the LDAP configuration or the SMTP configuration? Cool. Hearing none, I'll get forward. So I picked up as part of extending this to the incoming email configuration and the service desk email configuration. And I really sort of drug my feet for a little while on this. This was the first time that I had actually used our GDK to submit a merge request. And part of that there was part of a kind of a startup procedure for learning how we do things a little bit differently because of the size and the number of developers that are coming at the Rails application itself than we do in Omnibus and our charts and in our projects, our smaller projects. And so, there's a lot of activity. There's a little bit, the test framework and the test suite is the same, but it's a little structured a little differently. Some of the examples are a little different. And so I spent a fair amount of time kind of just digging in and trying to understand how the GDK was put together. And so I finally, began working on this, and as a straightforward, I'm showing the MR on the screen. At first, I'm thinking, hey, this is just going to be, I'm going to sort of copy and paste and understand what DG had done before with the SMTP and the LDAP secrets. I'm going to extend and copy that routine to using this to create the rake task for the incoming email and service desk email, write these encrypted files out, read it back in. And I get an implementation in place, and then it's really not working. And I'm like, whoa, what didn't work? What am I missing? What am I missing? And one of the lessons for me is I didn't really understand at the time, or didn't go back and look at the time, for how we go about parsing and loading the Mailroom configuration file. And I just want to kind of switch over to, this is the mailroom.yml that is in the core Rails app. And so the Mailroom configuration file that we ship is part of the Rails app, but how we execute Mailroom, which is a separate Ruby gem entirely, is outside of the Rails framework itself. So in Omnibus, we've got a run init configuration that loads this, that loads the service, is doing essentially a bundle that as the GDK does, but it's doing a bundle exec on the or it's actually loading the Rails environment, the gem environment local to the machine, and executing Mailroom. And Mailroom itself, the gem, will read an ERB configuration of this mailroom.yml file, which in turn loads a library out of the Rails app. So the way in which we're presenting this Mailroom config depends on our Rails app itself to load this Mailroom library in the GitLab app that has access to its settings. That file, and let me go back to, go back to my diff of this change. And so I'm going to scroll down to that library. And you can see my diff here, but at the time that it's loading, the initial implementation, that library is just loading YAML, it's just loading JSON, it's just loading a path name, and the Redis queues library that's part of the Rails app. So this initial implementation of the encrypted settings was built into the core Rails app settings class, but this Mailroom library doesn't load that settings class at all whatsoever. And so Mailroom, reading the ERB, loads this one class. It's in the Rails app, but has really nothing else to do with the Rails app itself other than this add-on of the Redis queues library. And so settings is not available. The settings library itself, as I scroll back up to the top of this, actually has one call to the Rails class that's in the core Rails app, just to pull the Rails or default back to the Rails environment, depending on if there's not an env set in the environment, and or a variable, the GitLab env in the environment. And so none of this encrypted configuration was available to that class. And to load it otherwise would have required loading settings, would have required loading all of Rails just for that one Rails.env call and everything that it pulls in. And so I really had to kind of go back and figure out, what can I just, do I reproduce the encrypted configuration class? Do I put all of this in Omnibus itself? Or do I leave this in the Rails app and try to load this in a minimal way? And so that's what I did, is that the initial encrypted configuration class needs a couple of routines out of active support. And that is what active support lets you break down the different components in it when you're requiring it. And so you don't need all of everything that active support would necessarily include. So here we can get away with just loading the core active support library. We end up needing, there's a call in one of those routines that needs this delegation module. So I'm loading active support, that delegation module, and then our own encrypted configuration class. And that lets us get at those routines, but at the same time, we've got to there's logic in here to reproduce some of loading settings, the core Rails settings itself, because we need the encryption key that is in GitLab secrets.json that gets loaded in, that is used for these files, that is used for the rake tasks, that's used in the Rails app itself. So this library ends up having to reproduce and copy some of the same logic from the settings library, and for reading in the core Rails settings and the core Rails secrets. And that was really the complexity that was involved here. And we sort of addressed this. DJ actually addressed this in commentary during the review that I'll point out, and I'll make sure this link is directly in the notes, about why your thoughts about the change and where we go forward as we're taking a look at the DB password and the and the Redis password. And that is the the brain dump of this encrypted settings library. What was involved a little bit in reading this in Mailroom, lessons that I learned about. One more addition that I want to put in as I submit this MR, and I ping Charlie Ablett to take a look at, because I know they had spent a fair amount of time in the mailroom configuration recently. Back in November, they had actually identified this very same thing that I ran into, and then just went full bore trying to work around as an issue for the Rails app itself, about loading what's involved in loading the mailroom YML. And that's something that I probably should have done some background and looked at the issues beforehand, because it wouldn't have caught me by surprise if I had known some of the issues, or if I had looked for some of the issues around mailroom and what's going on and some of the open items for how we interact with the mailroom gem. One thing that I want to mention is, and I'm not prepared as much to talk about it today, but one of the things involved in this is this will post some usage data to our Sisense data about the use of, if anybody configures this and sets their configuration and writes out an encrypted username and password for their incoming email configuration, it's active, and that presence, and for this MR, the presence of that file, that encrypted file, and those credentials in that file are an indication that it's active, that it will just pass a true value along as part of the usage data that a customer or a GitLab platform user is using this feature within the application. And I don't actually have, I'm not sure that I actually have access to Sisense on an individual level, so I've never actually seen this data in Sisense and the number of people that are using some of these encrypted features, but it's something useful to track. And it's what we started tracking it with LDAP, and we started tracking it with SMTP, and so this added tracking also for the incoming email. But we've changed how the usage data works, and there are now subclasses that are necessary. I'll look at the changes for doing that's the spec. Let's do here. Instrumentation classes that that you have to put in place for each individual instrumented metric. And so I just want to mention that in passing, sort of at the end of this. I won't go too much into the details of that implementation. In some ways, I just tested it by making sure that this was being sent to the GitLab versions application, that our tracking was there, that this metric was present. But in terms of how it gets read back out and used, I actually haven't. I didn't dive into the details there, but I'll provide some links to how this has changed over, and since initial implementation, and that in using these instrumentation classes. And that was my brain dump. That was pretty rambly, but if there are any questions or comments, or comments on the recording itself, if the screen sharing worked well here, just let me know. Otherwise, that's encrypted secrets, and how we're using it for LDAP SMTP, incoming mail, and how we might be able to use this for the database password and the Redis password as well. Okay, going once, going twice. I think we're good to go. Thank everyone for joining this morning. And if anything comes up afterwards, just ping me or let me know, or put questions in the doc, and we'll get that worked out. Thanks, everyone.